Okay, before I begin today's lecture, two very quick announcements. For those of you who did not pick up your exams on Thursday, since you weren't here, you can pick them up from me at the end of class today. Secondly, I've had some students wondering how they could improve their grade. I've had about 4 or 5 people, maybe more, who've come to see me. And what I want to mention to you is that, apart from obviously doing the readings and coming to the lectures, and if you're not physically at the lectures but you're able to listen to them on the podcast, I'm not sure there's much you can do beyond that except to really look at the material before you attentively think about what's being said, listen to the podcast repeatedly if necessary, all right, and do the readings, or at least the bulk of them. If you're not able to do all of the readings, you can make an assessment once you get the exam. Recall that this is going to be a take-home exam. You're going to have close to a week, 6 to 7 days, to answer the exam. But what I also want to add is this, that I'm going to give you a bonus question on the exam. So you're going to have 6 questions, and you have to answer 4 out of those 6 questions. But there is a bonus question, which is an additional question. So if you are inclined to want to improve your grade, the other option you have is to answer that bonus question. And the only point of reassurance I can give you on that is that if you don't do well on the bonus question, it won't go against you. But if you do well on it, it can help to lift up your grade, let's say from a B plus to an A minus, or from a C plus to a B minus. That is 1/3 of a letter grade. Okay? So, and it will be an essay question just like the others, and if you find that you have enough material to deal with already, if you have to answer 4 questions out of 6, and they're going to be all essay questions, obviously just of the sort that you had in your midterm exam, and you find that that's about all that you can handle, then obviously you just ignore the bonus question. But I wouldn't take a stab at it merely in the hope that it's going to help you improve your grade. If you really know the question and you think you're in a position to answer it and you have the time, you should certainly make an attempt at it. All right, so I think that that's really the best I can do in addition to giving the advice I've already given you about how you might possibly study for the exam. Okay, any questions that anybody has about the final exam? I think I pretty much explained it to you on a previous occasion as well, so yes. No, you get it. It's going to be emailed to you at the end of the last class, after the last lecture. And once I've emailed the exam to you, I cannot take any questions about the exam. Okay. But again, you'll get a set of instructions, how many pages, how you're to submit it, whether it's going to be emailed or whether it's going to be a hard copy or both. All of that will be explained in the instructions accompanying the exam. Yes. It's going to be due 6 to 7 days. I don't remember the exact date. I have to look at the calendar again, but not less than 6 days. Okay, so you have, in my view, ample time. Now, I know, by the way, there's some of you who say that you've got 3 other exams, but that's what it means, to manage your time. The universities has a certain period during which exams are handed out or given, and there's really no choice in the matter over there. It's not possible to schedule the exam a week before the end of classes or something of that kind. I mean, once in a while I get a question of that kind, whether it's possible to do that, and the answer is a resounding no. It's not possible to do that, right? So once this class is concluded, we've had the last lecture. Shortly thereafter, probably within 15 minutes, maybe an hour or so after that, the exam will be emailed to you. All right. Now, what I've been talking to you about in my previous lecture was the end of the rebellion of 1857, and I had given you a very brief idea of what was going to transpire in the subsequent 2-3 decades. Today, our intention is to take the narrative up to 1885. The bulk of the lecture is going to be devoted to looking at the question of women's reform movements, how gender plays into many of these discussions. And we're going to go up to 1885 because 1885 is the year when the Indian National Congress was founded. And the Indian National Congress is going to become the premier nationalist organization in the early part of the 20th century, circa 1919-1920. Mohandas Gandhi, otherwise known as Mahatma Gandhi, is going to essentially take charge of the Congress. And the Congress is the oldest such organization in the world, actually. It's the oldest nationalist party of that sort from the global south anywhere in the world. And the Indian National Congress became a highly influential organization because you think about the African National Congress, for example, was actually modeled on the Indian National Congress in many respects. And there are other similar nationalist parties elsewhere in the global south, which really looked very carefully at what was happening in India. Right? So the Congress, of course, exists today, as I said, a mere shadow of what it was under the time of Mohandas Gandhi and some of the other stalwarts of what is described as the nationalist struggle. But that's a story that we look at much later on. What I'm interested in doing for the moment is having you turn your attention to the left side of the board over here, where I've written a few terms to just alert you to some of the considerations that are important before we move to the question of gender and start to look, for example, very carefully at the question of Sati, the whole phenomenon of widow immolation and British attempts to abolish it. So 1858, the East India Company is no longer on the horizon. India is now a crown colony. There's a viceroy who represents the British government in India, and in Britain itself you have a Secretary of State for India. One thing I did not mention to you in my discussion of the political economy, and it's a rather important little detail, because the nationalists are going to pick up on that detail. And that detail is the fact that one of the ways in which India was, quote, bled. You remember I mentioned to you the drain theory, that India is being drained of its wealth. So one of the ways in which India is being drained is that India is responsible for what are called the home charges. So when let's take an illustration. Britain is an imperial power. India is not its only colony. Britain's got a huge number of colonies. They've got a number of colonies in Africa, for example, Nigeria, Kenya. Okay, obviously part of the Gulf states. All right, so forth and so on. Now, as we move into the second half of the 19th century and move into the 20th century, one of the things that Indians are going to be doing is they're going to be protecting the British Empire. So even though India itself is a colony and Indians themselves are being colonized, they're Indian soldiers who are going to be actually fighting on behalf of the British. Right? The question is, who's paying for these expenses? I mean, you send a contingent of Indian troops, 10,000 troops, to fight a battle somewhere, say in Afghanistan. Who's paying for them? You know, should it be paid by the British government in Britain, or should it be paid by the British government in India? So those are the home charges. In other words, India is actually being asked to pay for the expansion, giving you one illustration of what these home charges are, for the expansion of British rule elsewhere in the world. Right? Or, for example, civil servants, British civil servants. So there's the ICS, Indian Civil Service, right? And up till the early, 1880s, it's staffed almost entirely by the British. I mean, as late as the mid-1880s, there are fewer than 12 Indians actually serving in the Indian Civil Service. 12. Right? Now, when these British civil servants retire, so they've served in India for 30 years, they go back to Britain again. This is considered part of what are called the home charges. So India is actually going to pay for their pension the rest of their life. Right? And this is important because this is going to become, as I said, a ground for a grievance, which is going to be aired by the Indian nationalists when nationalism starts to become important. Now, what are the conditions for nationalism becoming important? The first condition is the emergence of what we might call a public sphere. So what's a public sphere? So public sphere is that if you go into the second half of the 19th century, the intellectual landscape is changing. Why is the intellectual landscape changing? Because of such things as the advent of the print media, newspapers, journals, magazines. Right? All of these are starting to proliferate. Of course, when they start to proliferate, the British are going to also have to do what? Impose censorship eventually. Right? So, something that we can't look into in any great detail, but and we're speaking about, by the way, not just about proliferation of newspapers and magazines in English. We're speaking about the proliferation of literature in Marathi, Bengali, Hindi, Urdu, Tamil, okay? Indian languages, and these are, I've just mentioned 5, there are obviously other Indian languages as well. Now, if there is a proliferation of literature in these languages, one of the things the British have to do is, and this is the project that goes back to the late 18th century, the conquest of knowledge, that how are they going to impose a censorship unless they know what's written in these newspapers? So they need a class of Indians, and that was the intent behind Macaulay, in part. Behind Macaulay's Minute on Indian Education. What is Macaulay's Minute on Indian Education? Recall the last few lines, which I had mentioned to you again on Thursday. And when I was describing to you how you'd written your papers and what might be some of the problems. That the intent is to create a class of Indians who are going to be English in feeling, in taste, in their sensibility. English in everything except blood. These are going to be the Indians who are going to actually start working for the British government in India. And many of them are going to staff the offices of the censorship board. Right? So the public sphere now is a sphere where we are saying that there's slowly a rising middle class. It's very minuscule at this point in time. I mean, the real growth of the middle class in India has only occurred in the last 20, 30 years. But when I say middle class, what I'm talking about is a class of people who are not Brahmins, who are now availing themselves of English education, right? Who are beginning to staff the university. So there we go. Education is obviously related, the rise of education. The university, the presidencies, the 3 presidencies, each of them is going to have a university founded in 1857, the year of the rebellion. Okay? University of Madras, University of Calcutta, University of Bombay. And then later on, you're going to get University of Allahabad and, of course, University of Delhi. But that's much later on, University of Delhi. Right? These are institutions which are obviously modeled after Western universities. And not that there is, by the way, a homogeneous blueprint for what a Western university is, because the German model of a university was quite different in some respects from an English model. But very broadly, we're saying that they're going to impart, obviously, education and science, mathematics, so forth and so on, and English is going to be the medium of instruction. Right? So these people who are graduates of these, they're slowly entering into what is now becoming a public sphere. And part of a public sphere is open debate. Open debate. And what is a debate about? Debate is about certain issues related to reform. Right? And what kind of reform movements are we speaking about? Some of the reform movements have to do with education, accessibility of girls, right, with respect to the question of education, accessibility of education for girls, for women, okay, right? But there are obviously a great many other, because it's not simply girls. What about the lower classes? What about the working classes? What is going to be the nature of education for them, right? What are the social taboos that have been prominent in Indian society? Right? How does one resolve certain kinds of caste differences? Does one go to the same panchayat institutions one had, or does one use the modern institutions of the state, of the colonial state, in order to be able to resolve certain kinds of caste differences, for example? So when I say reform movement, these are all linked. They're linked because the first thing to keep in mind is that when we speak about a public sphere, we're talking about the fact that a certain class of people have now come into this sphere. Okay, they're reasonably well educated by the standards of that day, right? By the standards of that day, they're reasonably well educated, right? They're interested in questions having to do with economics, social change, right? For example, the whole idea, what is the situation of India and the colonial economy? Some of these people will begin to discuss it. They're going to form clubs. Some of these clubs might be private meetings. This is all part of what we might describe as a public sphere, where newspapers, magazines have now become important. Public debates are going to be staged. And what I'm saying is that one of the things that's feeding into it is obviously the advent of a new style of education. Now, one needs to add one important footnote to this. When the rebellion of 1858 is crushed, the British are going to obviously argue that there are consequences that Indians have to live up to now. They're going to have to pay the price for having been disobedient, for having been mutinous. And it has been argued, and I think that there is reason to accept that argument, that the Muslims had to suffer the consequences of the rebellion to a greater portion than did the Hindus. Partly because Bahadur Shah Zafar, who is the Mughal emperor, who is asked by the rebels whether he will, take on the leadership of the movement, right? And as I said, we haven't discussed the exact circumstances under which he agreed to do so, because that's a very long story in itself. But the gist of it is that there is a coterie of people in the British administration of India, a large coterie, I should say, who are firmly persuaded that the Muslims are primarily responsible for having instigated this rebellion. And therefore, they should have to pay the price to a greater degree than the Hindus. All right? And if you read the great poet Khalid, right? So he's an Urdu poet, and Khalid is one of the great Urdu poets in the 19th, 20th century, the last 200 years, one of the 2 or 3 greatest figures in Urdu poetry. Well, Khalid was present in Delhi in 1857, 1858. And if you read some of his letters that he writes, he describes that Delhi became virtually a ghost town. And recall that Delhi has had a long history, right? I've discussed just a little bit of that history in passing, right? Just in passing. But this is where the Delhi Sultanate was based 600, 700, 800 years ago. Then the Mughal emperors, of course, set up a capital in Delhi as well, Shahjahanabad. Right? And this is where the Red Fort was then stormed by British troops, as I described to you in my previous lecture in 1857. Now, if you read Ghalib's letters, what he talks about is how Delhi had become a ghost town. There are jackals on the street, howling at night, acute shortages of water, food. Many of the Muslims had been driven out by the British. Muslim landlords had been stripped of their lands. And he describes in graphic detail, right, what's happening in Delhi. Now, what is the relationship of all of this to what we're speaking about? The relationship is the following, and that's a little detail that's important here. That what Khalid is suggesting in his letters is that the Muslims have had to pay a price for the rebellion of 1857, 1858. And one of the reactions of the Muslims was to become insular. Okay, so when you are an oppressed group, you can react in different ways. One of the ways in which you might react over a period of time is to stage a rebellion, again, if you can. The other is to become insular. So the critical factor here is this. If you look, for example, at the work of a historian who wrote a book a few decades ago called The Muslims of British India. His name is Peter Hardy, The Muslims of British India. Now, one of the things that Peter Hardy shows very clearly in that book is that if you look at the decades of the 1860s, 70s, 80s, 90s, so we're talking about the decades, 3-4 decades after the rebellion, when I'm saying that now the British are saying, okay, look, the rebellion is over, let's put all of this behind us. This is a time when Indians should be thinking about advancing their own interests, social improvement, reform movements, right? Queen Victoria has issued a proclamation after the rebellion. What does Victoria say after the rebellion is crushed? She says that I give an assurance to all my Indian subjects that they shall be treated fairly. The question is not whether they were treated fairly. Let's not move into that question. This is a proclamation that she issues. And Victoria herself in time will be declared to be Empress of India. She's going to add that to her title, so that she is the sovereign of India. And when I, Victoria, make a proclamation, I accept you Indians as my subjects. I'm going to treat you exactly as I treat my English subjects. That's a proclamation that she makes. And she suggests in the proclamation that now we need to look forward to a time of peace and prosperity. Now, when there's a time of peace and prosperity, you would think that people will get interested in education. However, what Peter Hardy shows in his book, The Muslims of British India, is the Muslims did not take to education. Okay? So, for example, for every 30, I don't remember the exact ratio, for every 30 Indians who acquired a bachelor's degree, for every 30 Hindus, who acquired a bachelor's degree, one Muslim did. Although the proportion of Muslims to Hindus in undivided India is roughly 20-25% of the population. Right? So what he's saying is that one reaction of the Muslims to 1857, 1858, and to the oppression unleashed by the British in putting down not only the rebellion, but in its aftermath, in dealing out certain consequences, certain punishments, that one reaction of the Muslims to that was to become insular, to withdraw inside their own community. And this has repercussions moving into the early 20th century. In fact, it has repercussions down to the present day. You know, there was a report that was released by the government of India. It's called the Sanchar Committee report 3 years ago. And one of the things that the Sanchar Committee report found out was that if you look at Muslims in India today, right, and as you know, India has one of the largest Muslim populations in the world. India, Indonesia, Pakistan and Bangladesh are the countries with the largest Muslim populations of the world. If you look at Muslims in India today, they lag behind Hindus considerably in most of the professions, in access to, not just in access to education, but in their willingness to take up education. Right? And we're saying that some of this goes back to the 19th century. And you'll have to keep this in mind, because we're going to have to ask ourselves the obvious logical question. What is going to be the response of Muslims to nationalism? When nationalism becomes a potent force, okay, who is going to lead that movement? To what extent are Muslims going to take part in that movement as well? Right? Are they going to similarly distance themselves from that? How do they position themselves between the Hindus on the one hand, assuming, by the way, that we can speak of all of these as distinct monolithic communities, you know, Muslims, Hindus, because there's no reason to believe that all Hindus similarly thought of themselves only as Hindus, or that they said, well, you know, my interests as a Hindu coincide with the interests of all other Hindus. There's no reason to believe that. And the same thing would have to be said about Muslims. But nonetheless, the question that is going to be important is, to what extent did Muslims take part in nationalism? Right? To what extent, more broadly, are they part of this emerging public sphere? Now, these decades are also decades when certain controversies arise. And I wanted to give you an illustration of only one of these controversies, which is a controversy that over what is called the Ilbert Bill. Right? And what is the Ilbert Bill? Ilbert Bill is a bill that is introduced by a British member of the Legislative Assembly in India. Okay, so there is, by the way, you know, there are certain, quote, democratic institutions that there are no Indians serving in them. Just keep that in mind at this point in time, right? So what would the Ilbert Bill have allowed to do? And why was the Ilbert Bill passed, right? What the Ilbert Bill would have allowed is, it would have allowed Indian judges to try cases involving Europeans in the countryside. All right, so if you look at the Presidency Towns, right, so you recall what are the Presidency Towns, right? So this is the Presidency Towns, when I'm speaking about the three big ones, or cities rather. So you're talking about Calcutta over here, your Bombay and Madras, right? Now in these Presidency Towns or cities, Indians were allowed to be judges in cases involving Europeans. Criminal cases, for example, involving Europeans. A European is accused of arson or murder or something. His case comes to court. The judge who's presiding is an Indian. Yes, an Indian can preside over a case, right, where a European is being tried in the Presidency Towns. The Ilbert Bill would have extended that privilege to Indian judges to be able to try such cases outside the Presidency Towns. And you would say, well, if they could do so in the Presidency Towns, why was there such a ruckus? Because what is the reaction of the bill? A huge ruckus.
a controversy erupts where the British say this is unacceptable. Partly because when you move away from the presidency towns and you get into the countryside, you get into a class of Anglos who are essentially businessmen, traders, planters. Who's running the tea plantations in Assam and Darjeeling? Okay? And these people are people who do not accept the authority of Indians. All right? That's the distinction here. So when this bill is introduced, named after the person who introduced the bill, what this bill would have done is it would have extended this privilege and to Indian judges to be able to try cases involving Europeans outside the presidency towns, right? And as I said, it's going to become extremely controversial. It's going to be withdrawn. And in fact, actually, the resolution henceforth is going to be that these cases are now going to be tried under a jury, of which at least in cases involving Europeans, of which at least more than half the members, more than 50% of the members of any jury involved in a case where a European is being tried has to be comprised of white people. Not just in the countryside, but in the presidency towns. So in fact, actually it backfires so badly because the presidency towns, which were relatively a bit more progressive in this respect, are now going to adopt the same canon, right? So this is an illustration of the kind of controversy that's going to arise. And of course, this is going to become something that the nationalists are going to rake up later on, because they're going to say, this is a wonderful illustration of the racism that is absolutely rampant, right, in colonial structures. Because of course the logical question to ask is, why should it matter whether you are being tried by an Indian judge or not? If the judge is competent, assuming that the judge is competent, why should it matter whether you're being tried by an Indian judge or not? Right? So this is essentially what we're speaking about. If you're looking at this period, 1858, right, through the 1880s, 1885 is just a convenient cutoff mark here simply because it's the founding of the Indian National Congress. But what I'm describing, this emergence of the public sphere, access to education, the background provided by Queen Victoria's proclamation that now this is a period when we're going to usher in relative peace and prosperity, the advancement of irrigation in the Punjab, introduction of new canals, okay, so forth and so on. This is how one might characterize this period from the late 1850s moving into the 1880s, 1890s. Now what I want to do is I want to turn my attention to one particular aspect of some of these debates, but we're going to have to go back to the period before the 1850s. And I want to begin with the question of Sati. Right? So what is Sati, and why is it that the British decided that they had to undertake an action on the issue of Sati? So Sati is the phenomenon of widow immolation. Okay, widow immolation, and very simply, what does it mean? We're not going to be able to enter into a long, intricate history of what are the origins of Sati. What evidence do we have for Sati, for example, in the 16th century, 17th century, 18th century, so forth and so on. What I can tell you is that if you look at Sati roughly around 1800, we're talking about 500, 600, 700 cases, okay, per annum, yearly. 500, 600, 700 cases. We have a huge body of material to study Sati. For example, parliamentary reports. Right? So when I speak about parliamentary reports, these are reports which are part of the proceedings of the British Parliament, where the British Parliament says, well, we want a report on the phenomenon of Sati. How do you put together a report of this kind? You ask for documents from India. You ask that British officials stationed in small towns in Bengal keep an eye on what is happening. When they see a Sati, they make a note of it. And then they provide a cumulative report, how many satis were performed or committed in this area under my particular jurisdiction. What was the average age of the woman? What is sati? A sati is where a woman performs self-immolation. That is that when her husband has died, and as you know, in Hinduism, you burn the body. You don't bury the body, right? So you burn the body. So when her husband's body is on the funeral pyre, she will join her dead husband on that funeral pyre. Okay? That's the phenomenon of sati. And as I said, there's a whole series of extremely complicated questions. You know, to what extent was this prevalent in India? Was it widespread? So, for example, there was a major argument advanced by Ashish Nandi regarding satis in the 18th century, a piece that he wrote over 30 years ago, where one of the things that he argued was that the incidence of sati rose substantially under colonial rule because of the kinds of dislocations, okay, and anomie, social anomie created by colonial rule. What do I mean by that? For example, the famine that always hovers in the background there, right? The famine of 1770 in Bengal, which kills 10 million people. What happens in a famine? What happens is obviously that there are some people who are going to become more vulnerable than others, because they don't have the entitlements, right? So if you have a family, and let's say it's a joint family, 3 generations or 4 generations living in that family, right? In this family, you get shortages of food. And it becomes very clear over a period of time that it's not going to be possible to feed everybody in the family. Somebody is going to have to suffer, right? Who is going to suffer? Who is going to pay the price? So a woman, for example, who is no longer fertile, right? If she has now reached menopause, she can no longer produce children, right? Elderly people, elderly women. So you find when they compile the sati reports, one of the things that they find is that 65% of the cases, for example, are women who are really mature. That is, they're beyond the age of 40. And you might think, age of 40, that's not really mature. But keep in mind the life expectancy in India at that time. Okay? Right? What we're speaking about is that certain people in these conditions become more dispensable. Right? And so one of the things he was trying to argue is that the incidence of sati goes up under these conditions of social anomie, complete chaos, right? Breakdown of the social order. We are not in a position to be able to do justice to the argument and say, well, is the argument, sustainable or not? What we are interested in is a somewhat different question. And that question is, the British see this phenomenon and they argue that we have a moral obligation to ban sati. Now, there are a number of problems afflicting women and girls in particular. Okay, so female infanticide, for example. So let's put sati in a context. What is the context? The context is, right, go back to circa 1800. So we're talking about the whole ethos of improvement. That one of the justifications the British have is that, well, we have a moral obligation to improve Indian society, right? And that means to rid it of certain kinds of social evils. One of these social evils is obviously something called sati. But the context is that there is a whole range of social issues, right? Some of which afflict women in particular, some of which afflict larger segments of Indian society. So what would be an example of something that afflicts larger segments of Indian society? For example, the question of education. Who has access to education? What is the nature of public education? Because it's not simply girls who need public education, it's obviously boys who need working class people, lower caste people, so forth and so on. Right? However, what is very clear is that there are a certain number of problems that particularly afflict women. So, for example, the prohibition on widow remarriage. In certain very orthodox communities, right? And generally these prohibitions and taboos are to be encountered in upper caste communities, really upper caste communities. The lower down you move the social order, the fewer taboos they are. And why is that the case? Because the higher up you are, the caste ladder, the greater the sources of contamination and pollution. All right? So many of the taboos are taboos that are only exist with respect to the upper caste. So in certain orthodox Brahmin communities, a woman, I should say rather a girl in many cases, could not remarry if she became a widow. What if she became a widow at the age of 14? Because it was not at all uncommon, not at all uncommon for a girl to be married at the age of 10 or 12. And her, quote, husband would also, by the way, be usually within that age group. Sometimes there are communities where, in fact, the husband could have been 40, 50 years old. Okay? Very small set of sub-cases over there. Right? The sort of thing, by the way, for those of you who read about Afghanistan, once in a while you'll hear this, okay, and immediately people say, that shows just how backward this society is. All right? So keep that scenario in mind. So what we are saying here is a girl gets married at the age of 10. The usual practice, by the way, was that if you got married before puberty, you would not join your husband in his household until such time as you have reached puberty. Okay? So if you're betrothed at the age of 6 or 7, it doesn't mean that you get sent off to your husband's home. No, you stay in your natal home, in your biological home, and it's only when a girl has achieved puberty that she is now going to be sent off. Okay? So she's 12 years old. She has never even consummated her sexual life at all, because she's technically never even stayed with her husband. And suddenly her family gets news, oh, your husband was in the fields and he got bitten by a cobra and he's dead. So she's a widow. She's technically a widow at this point. And in those very orthodox communities, she could not be permitted to remarry. So that is the prohibition on widow remarriage. This is going to become a huge affair for Indian social reformers who are going to say this is obviously unjust. Right? Of course, the British are going to chime in with their views about this because, as I said, there's a whole range of issues which the British are looking at, and in particular issues having to do with women and girls. So widow remarriage, okay, in female infanticide in particular, female infanticide, right? Girls' education. What proportion of girls had any education at all? And then, more than anything else, sati. Now, this is important to underscore because take, for example, girls' education. If the British said in 1820, you Indians are a deplorable lot of people because you don't allow your girls to get educated. What is one problem with that argument? One problem with that argument was girls were not being educated in England either in 1820. I want you to remember that. They're not being educated in England either. And you know that most of the major universities, even in the United States, it was only in the 60s, 70s that many of the major universities are actually now going to start having female students. In 1800 or 1820, being a young woman in Britain didn't mean that you had access to education, not at all. So it's very difficult for the British to say, this is really the problem in your society, okay, that your girls have absolutely no access to education. Yes?
Was that an active claim that they were making?
Oh, no. You see, you have to read tacitly what's happening. The question is this: why does sati become so important for the British? Keep that question in mind. And when I say why does it become so important, and you might say, what is the evidence for that? There's plenty of evidence. What is the evidence? Huge number of parliamentary reports, okay, produced on the question of sati. Huge number of parliamentary reports. Every British traveler who went through India and spent some time, I'm not going to call this the sati tour, not yet, okay, but you're getting close to it. The idea was you had to try to witness a sati because it was exotic. Here's this funeral pyre and there's this young woman and she's going to jump into it. The British, this is exotic, frankly. It's a spectacle. So a lot of these travel narratives, they're going to try to include an episode where the traveler says, I watched a sati, okay, and this is what I saw. And by the way, some British say, hey, this is marvelous because look at their bravery and loyalty. I wish our women were like that. And actually some travelers are going to argue that, by the way. And there's this whole debate that is going to take place before the abolition of sati about, distinguishing between voluntary satis and involuntary satis. And one of the things that the piece that you're reading by Lata Mani argues is that, look, we have to be very careful that we don't get seduced by such arguments about voluntary satis versus involuntary. The distinction is quite obvious. That is, if you look at the terms itself. An involuntary sati is where a woman, she's, let's say, 20 years old, her husband has died, and she's not willing to jump into the funeral pyre, but her relatives, male relatives in particular, are all standing there saying that, no, you have a moral obligation to join your husband in heaven. And so she's not reluctant to go, and so they'll push her into the fire. That's, quote, an involuntary sati. Right? But what if she says, no, I want to join my husband on the funeral pyre, my deceased husband. My life has now come to an end. This is what it means to be really brave, loyal, heroic, so forth and so on. Let's say a version of Joan of Arc. Okay, putting it in terms that might be a bit more familiar to you. Right? What does it mean to speak about chivalry, heroism, so forth and so on? That would be the so-called distinction. And I think that the piece by Lata Mani and many other scholars have argued that I think is quite right in arguing that we should not at all be seduced by this particular distinction between so-called voluntary satis and involuntary satis. All right? But you see what we're getting to now. What we're getting to go back to that question, is that if you look at the general position of females in England in 1800, 1820, you can by no stretch of the imagination argue, not even remotely, that they had anything called equality with men. Not even remotely. So, but what the British are seeking to do is they are seeking to find some phenomenon which cannot be replicated in their society. Right? Some phenomenon which would mark the Indians as the other. The other. Okay? The other that is markedly different from themselves. And this is one reason why sati becomes so absorbing to them, of such great interest to them. Right? Yes, because it also gives them the moral justification for saying, this is just sheer barbarism, and we have a moral obligation to get rid of it. But what it also does is it enables them to mark themselves off as, in fact, completely different from the Indians. Right? Which is one reason why sati is going to receive a huge amount of attention in colonial literature in the second decade, third decade, right, of the 19th century. Yes?
Even if the widow voluntarily wanted to confront
Yeah.
her, they would let her?
Oh, no, they would. That's because in fact, by an act of 1813, the British declared sati to be legal, provided it was a voluntary act. If it was a voluntary act. In 1829, so let's move to the piece of legislation, and what we're interested in is trying to understand how this piece of legislation took place and what it tells us about the role of women in this debate. What happened in 1829? In 1829, the British got rid of this distinction between voluntary and involuntary sati, and they declared sati to be illegal in all the territories of British India. But remember that just 16 years before that, right, the British said sati is actually legal provided it is a voluntary act. Then, of course, you needed some people. How do you assess whether it's voluntary or not? You might have conflicting testimony, right? A woman who's been pushed into the fire, of course, her relatives are going to say she went into the fire. She wanted to be with her husband, right? So forth and so on. So how do you assess? Does a British official have to be present in order to be able to certify a sati as voluntary or involuntary, right? What are the prohibitions? Can everybody commit sati? No, everybody cannot commit sati. For example, a woman who had children could not commit sati. Because if she commits sati, then obviously she may be joining her husband, she may be fulfilling one part of her moral code, but she is obviously renouncing another moral obligation because she's abandoning her children, right? So a woman who had children could not commit sati. Yes?
But isn't it more like suicide and how if the British were Christians?
Yeah, you see, but that's what I'm trying to suggest. To try to unravel exactly what this phenomenon is, what is its history, how widespread it was, right? That's a subject in itself. That's a huge subject in itself. What we're interested in here is whether, for example, it is suicide or not. Okay? And then, of course, let's take your question at its face value, or if it's suicide, then how do Hindus look at suicide? We'd have to answer that then, wouldn't we? Then we'd have to look at, for example, the Catholic teaching. Catholic Church has an explicit set of teachings on suicide. Suicide is forbidden in the Catholic tradition because it's an abandonment of your station in life. Right? But that's what I mean, that we will get into a whole range of questions which are going to take us far afield from what we're interested in at the moment. So in 1829, the British decide to abolish sati. Now what we're interested in is, how did they come to this decision? Okay? How did they reach this decision? What was the role of Indians in this debate? So who are the actors in this particular debate? And this is where the Lata Mani piece comes in. All right? So the actors in the debate are roughly the following. Indian reformers. And who are the Indian reformers? Indian reformers led by? They are led by a man called Ram Mohan Roy. Okay? His name is spelled, by the way, in a couple of different ways, so I'm just using one variant. You might find another variant in some of your readings. So the reformers are led by Ram Mohan Roy. And I'll explain the position of each of these. And then I'll tell you why the Lata Mani piece is such a significant piece. And I think is extraordinarily useful for those of you who are interested in feminist analysis, for example. Okay? So this is one school of thought, is the Indian reformers. Then you have, for lack of a better word, let's call them the conservatives. Okay? Conservatives, or let's say the orthodox, okay, school of Hindus, who oppose attempts to proscribe sati. They don't want any intervention. That this is, that we have a social practice. Let it persist. Let it continue. Giving you the shorthand version of it. Right. The third actor is the colonial state. Right. The third actor is a colonial state. And if I said to you that these are really the only actors, okay, what would be the first problem that would come to your mind? Who is not, as a separate group, included in the group, in the list of actors? Women. Where are women in this debate? And to cut to the chase, Lata Mani's argument is going to be, women are neither the subjects nor the objects of this debate. And we want to try to understand what exactly she means by that, because it's really a fantastic argument if you think about it and what she's trying to really argue over here. They are neither the subjects, so they're not. It's not as though the colonial state or Ram Mohan Roy or the Orthodox, they all went to some of these women in their 20s, 30s, 40s, right, and said, "Oh, madam, what do you think about sati?" No, nobody actually asked any woman what she thought. Even the parliamentary reports that you read, okay, if you read the parliamentary reports, some of them, go on for 100, 200 pages. Not a single woman is actually ever asked, what does she think about the phenomenon of sati? Ostensibly, the whole idea of the legislation is to provide moral upliftment of Indian society, and in particular, moral upliftment of Indian women. Right? That Indian women need to be saved from the wretched men that they have to live with in that society. Right? That's ostensibly the argument. Right? Now, what Lata Mani says is, okay, let's try to understand how did the British come to this decision. And recall that there's these distinctions, voluntary sati, involuntary sati, right? Because this debate, the abolition of sati is in 1829, but of course the debate starts much earlier, right? The debate, the calls for the abolition of sati are already being made, right? So now the question number one is, how do we establish whether sati is going to be legal or not? Because if you simply said, well, it ought to be abolished because it's immoral, well, frankly, that's not much of an argument. Because if you think about it, right, we ought to abolish you know, X, Y, or Z because it's immoral. Well, then it's extremely subjective. Immoral according to whom? According to what standards? How do we know that this is immoral if there's a group of people who clearly think that it's not? Right? So one way to determine that is to say, what does Indian tradition say about this? What does Indian tradition say about this? You know, I mean, you could take, for example, a contemporary example around which there's a fair bit of discussion: female genital mutilation. That is prevalent in some traditions, some cultures, okay? And you know, lots of modern women might say, this is repulsive, you know, absolutely impermissible. Agreed. But that assumes that we are all sharing the same moral point of view, and what's to say that our moral point of view is the one that we should be attempting to argue is the best one. 200, 300 years ago, many of the things, well, for example, 19th century slavery, what today you all think is evil, large sectors, the vast majority of white people were complicit in the view that it's perfectly fine. So how did it change, didn't it, over a period of time? Right? So now the question is, they're going to say, well, one way to determine whether sati, right, should be allowed or not is to find out what the Indian tradition says about this. Now, what's the problem there? Now think about what the problem is once you've said that. So what is Indian tradition? Which text are you going to go to determine what Indian tradition is? Right? It's not like saying, there's something called the Quran and then there are the hadiths. Even there, by the way, the hadiths might vary quite a bit. Okay? But here, what are you going to go to? Which text are you going to go to? Which text is authoritative? Remember the questions we've been talking about. You see how they're coming into play here. Okay? Then the question is going to be, how do you access those texts? Let's assume that you said there were 8 or 10 texts. How do you access those texts? How do you interpret them? Because clearly how communities have interpreted those texts is certainly important. You have to go to the Brahmins. The problem is that you distrust those Brahmins because they're a conniving, right, cunning lot of people. Right? You're a colonial official. You have a mindset where you already have a trope. One of those tropes is the cunning, wily Brahmin, like a fox. How are you going to trust this man to tell you, right, what is the correct tradition? So this is going to be the problem. And one of the things that she's arguing, so here are the questions for you. Why did text become so important in this debate? Number one. Okay, why did text become so important? And a separate question, entirely separate question, by the way, which you should keep in mind always. Can one, in fact, change these things through legislation? I think we all believe, that's the liberal view, is that yes, all we need is better legislation. I think there's enough in even modern history to put a serious question mark on that. Legislation can tell you that you should not discriminate against another person. These are the consequences for discriminating. Okay? Legislation cannot make you love another person. You have to keep that in mind. All right? So, but as I said, that's a separate question. Why the British thought that the use of legislation would be the most effective way in order to remedy this question is a problem that we can only hint at, because partly it has to do with the place of law, place of rule of law in the British imagination, not just with respect to India, but back in Britain itself. Okay? And of course, a logical question of that, asking that question, is that does legislation in fact obscure some of the real issues? Right? It may in fact actually obscure them. Now, so let's go back to the first question. Why do texts become so important? Okay? Why are scriptures so important? And partly they're important, we're saying, because the British view is that this is the only way to access whether in fact sati is an authentic phenomenon or not. Okay? If the scriptures, if the Indian scriptures sanction it, right, then it's authentic. And if there's conflict between different scriptures, right, one scripture says this, the other scripture says something quite different, Then what you do is you try to reconcile this by looking at the majority of the scriptures, and what they say, you bring in the Brahmins, see how they interpret it, right? This is partly what the reformers are going to attempt to do, because Ram Mohan Roy is going to say, I do not find any scriptural sanction for sati. But you might say, by the way, that he's fallen into the colonial trap, because the colonial trap is that you determine, okay, what is right by looking at the scripture. So this importance given to the text, Lata Mani is saying, is in fact something of a problem. Now, what are the assumptions made by the colonial state? There are several assumptions that they make. One assumption that they make is that sati is a religious act. But again, one can't be quite certain of that, because you'd have to look at the particulars of each sati. Let's say a man dies, okay, and he's got two brothers. I'm giving you a hypothetical example. In fact, these examples were quite common. He's got two brothers, and let's say the man who dies is a rich landlord. He's got lots of property, right? Now, if his wife is still alive, she stands to inherit the property. So one way to make sure that she doesn't inherit the property and the two brothers is for the two brothers to say, let her commit sati. And, let's just gently coax her into the fire, okay? Right? You can see. Now, is this a religious? No, this is just sheer greed, frankly. Nothing to do with religion at all. Yeah, you could use the cloak of religion maybe, but they're assuming, by the way, that the only legitimate grounds for the discussion of sati is to view it as a religious act. And it may not be that. And that's where the Nandi argument becomes important as well, to try to understand, did the incidence of sati go up? Was there such severe economic dislocation in Indian society, for example, right, that it led to situations where certain people, certain women in this case, were viewed as being more dispensable than others, right? So the assumptions made by the colonial states, number one, is about the religious nature of sati. Number two, the centrality. So this goes back to that question about text, the centrality of scriptures, Brahminical scriptures, as opposed to custom, for example. And local custom might vary. Right? Local custom, local interpretation, understanding might vary. You go to these Brahminical scriptures. And number three, quite important, a corollary of the first and the second, but we won't think about it. And that is their assumption that Indians have an unreflective obedience to these texts. That, the scripture says that, so therefore all the Indians are going to say yes. All the Hindus are going to say that this is a moral obligation on us. Okay? Well, I don't know if that's how people always actually interact even with religious texts. No, I don't think so at all. There are, because clearly there are moments when we defy the religious text. Even if we're religious, there are certain portions of it, right, that so if you look at the New Testament and Old Testament, and what is the status of women in these texts? Well, clearly, even somebody who is religious might say, well, I'm simply going to ignore what it says about women. Okay? Give you a simple illustration, but the illustration is only intended to convey the idea that there is, according to the colonial state, an unreflective obedience on the part of Indians to their texts. Right? So these are the three assumptions that are now actually being made by the colonial authorities. So now, what is Lata Mani's argument then, in effect, right? So we know, so the reformers, Ram Mohan Roy says, now let me say a little bit more about him. And here I want you to look at this organization called the Brahmo Samaj, which is founded by Ram Mohan Roy in 1828. See, Ram Mohan Roy is a Bengali social reformer. Very often, by the way, he's referred to as the father of modern India. This partly comes from the conceit that what Ram Mohan Roy was successful in doing was in initiating what is called the Bengal Renaissance. Okay, so if you look at Indian history books, you'll always find a description of this Bengal Renaissance. The Bengal Renaissance is the beginning of social reforms, the creation of a new rubric of society, a different social order, and eventually moving into the second half of the 19th century, first part of the 20th century, the flowering of art, literature, music, so forth and so on. Right? That's the Bengal Renaissance. As somebody I know once quipped, it's the longest continuing Renaissance in the world. The Bengalis still think they're at the helm of this Bengal Renaissance, as it's called, or at least some of them do. Right? So what is a Brahmo Samaj? The Brahmo Samaj is an organization founded by Ram Mohan Roy, and Ram Mohan basically is saying he's agreeing in some respects with the colonial view. The colonial view is, look, the real problem as far as text goes in India is how do you access the Ur text, the original authentic text? Because this text has been around in the oral tradition, then there are different recensions, variations of this text. It's been around for millennium, maybe 2 millennia, maybe longer, depending on the nature of the text. Okay, how does one access this text? Because so much has grown up around the text, right? And Ram Mohan Roy is actually firmly persuaded, if I may put it this way, that Hinduism is in fact actually very much a monotheistic religion. And this is of course the first fallacy, because he's already accepted the terms of the debate, because this is not really the category that Hindus use to describe their own religions. Monotheism, as opposed to what? Polytheism, obviously. Right? So what he is interested in doing is finding that core text, because he is quite firmly persuaded, what? That in fact, many of the things that you find that are unacceptable in these texts are things that are added later on. Okay? That the original core text is of a very different sort. Okay, and this is what the Brahmo Samaj is going to do. It's going to be an organization of Bengali intellectuals, sort of a middle class, and that is going to be dedicated to the idea of recreating Hinduism more or less in the image of a modern faith. Okay, that's what the Brahmo Samaj is going to do, founded in 1828 by Ram Mohan Roy. And his role so he's the chief instigator, because of course the colonial state is saying we cannot undertake an action of this kind on such a critical issue unless this action is initiated by Indians themselves. I mean, it's the abolition of Sati. And this is where the reformers, led by Ram Mohan Roy, are going to come into the picture. Right? And so very often, Ram Mohan himself is going to be given the credit for the abolition of Sati. And then we have the conservative position, who are obviously going to dispute the position of the interpretation of the scriptures. They're going to describe this as an attempt by the British to meddle in the social and religious life of Indians, so forth and so on. And the colonial states, we've already seen what their view is on this matter. Now, Lata Mani's argument basically is this then, that number one, as I said, this is a debate only ostensibly about women. In fact, it has nothing to do with women at all. It has nothing to do with women, because all the parties to the debate agree that what we have to think about is tradition, scripture. Okay? That's what the debate is really about. What is the right tradition? What is the inauthentic tradition? What do the scriptures say? How does one determine what is the correct scripture? It's not as if anybody is really saying, hey, this has to do with the rights of women, or let's use a modern language, the right of a woman to take possession of her own body and decide what she wishes to do with it. Right? Nobody argued like that, of course, in the early 19th century anywhere in the world. Right? But what we're saying is that nobody is really interested in that part of the debate. Okay? And we have to only go by the evidence. Somebody might say that, well, yes, I'm sure that Ram Mohan Roy was really fired by the idea that women should be emancipated, that they should not be subject to such restrictions, so forth and so on. Well, yes, that may very well be the case. But what we have to go by is, for example, what he wrote. The pamphlets produced on both sides of the debate. This is the public sphere, by the way. Okay? This is the first beginnings. Of course, it's going to get considerably enhanced, because to some extent, these are now public debates. Right? And so not only are women themselves not consulted, that they are not subjects, they are not agents saying that we want to have a hand in saying what we think about this legislation, which is purportedly about saving us. Not only that, women are not even the objects of this discourse. It's not as though the debate is really about women. This debate is about something quite different. Okay? So this is really the essence of this piece, and I think it gives us a very good insight into into what is happening not only in colonial India with respect to the question of women in the first half of the 19th century, but it augurs, it's an omen of things to come, because the real question to be asked is whether in fact many of the debates that take place in the late 19th century, okay, second half of the 19th century in this period of reform movements are going to be somewhat similar. All right. Now, let me just very briefly describe. So we are on the subject of women and the question of what are some of the reforms that are attempted to be initiated into Indian society as a way of trying to improve their social economic position. Let me make one or two general observations, and then I want to move to a discussion of some of these organizations, and then we'll come back, and we may not be able to do it today, to some other questions having to do with women and their location to nationalism. All right, so those are roughly the questions I want to look at. Number one, the general observation that you need to keep in mind is why is it that reforms having to do with women are so critical, okay, in the 19th century? Right? What is the assumption? And this is something I've spoken to you about, but now this is a time to reiterate the argument. The assumption is that by the early 19th century that we should be able to evaluate civilizations according to a scale. Where does a civilization stand in relation to other civilizations? Okay? Today you would say nation state. You know, the UNDP doesn't look, United Nations Development Program, when they issue their annual report about the state of the world, okay, they don't look at something called civilizations, they look at nation states, and they'll rank 191 or 192, whatever it is, nation states. And what are the criteria they're going to use to decide which nation state is the most advanced nation state in the world? So you've got the core criteria, and then you've got supplementary criteria. So the core criteria would include such things as literacy. What percentage of the population is literate? And then within that, you might do a breakdown of female literacy and male literacy. Okay? That would be a core criteria. Another core criteria might be what percent of the population has access to potable drinking water, piped drinking water. What percentage of the population has access to a toilet? Okay? Yeah, you read the New York Times today. 1/3 of the population of the world does not have access to a toilet. 1/3. Huge number. Okay? And then you'll get supplementary criteria. I mean, these are not the only ones. There are some supplementary criteria. Those would have to do with, okay, what is the infant mortality rate? What is the maternal mortality rate? What is the number of hospital beds for every 100,000 people, okay, living in a place, or every 10,000? So forth and so on, right? What percentage of the population has access to electricity? Etc., etc. And you then say, and right now if you look at it, I don't know which is the country at the top, it's probably Norway or Iceland or one of these places, and then Denmark, Sweden, there is usually the Scandinavian countries and Germany and Japan. The US is somewhere around 15 or 20 usually on this scale, and then you get all obviously much of Asia and Africa way down at the bottom. India is like 115 or something at the moment, okay, right? 115. It might imagine itself as a great global superpower or about to become one, but it's 115 on that list. Okay? So now in the early 19th century, the evaluation scale is very simple. You judge a civilization by how it treats its women. Of course, by that criteria, all of them should be failing in the early 19th century. Certainly in the early 19th century, all of them should be getting an abysmal F or something lower than that. But this is all relative. It's all relative, right? Right? And there are actually, very distinguished writers in the world, including Nobel Prize winners, who have said such things as, I'm thinking about, for example, Saul Bellow, a Nobel Prize winner in literature, who said that the Yoruba in Nigeria were obviously greatly inferior to any Western civilization because they had not produced a Shakespeare or a Beethoven, right? So clearly in the early 19th century, well, no Indian had produced a Jane Austen. At least I'm not aware of any Jane Austen who had come about in India in 1800, okay, right? Of course, how many Jane Austens there were in England itself is another question, right? So you see, this is, there's nothing, quote, objective. It's not really an evaluative scale, but that's how they think of it. And of course, India is going to be ranked way down in the early 19th century under colonial rule, because they're going to say, look at Sati. This is an indication of the fact that India is way down on that evaluative scale of where it stands in relationship to other cultures. Okay? And of course, that will then provide the charge for saying, well, we need to do something about it. We need to do something about it. And Indian reformers are, in a manner of speaking, going to say, well, we have to now accept this charge, and we have to do something about it. The onus is on us. So that's why in the second half of the 19th century, well, you can already see it with Ram Mohan Roy, but clearly when you go into the second half of the 19th century, 1870s, when the dust has settled down after the rebellion, relatively, right, that Indian social reformers are going to say, we need to move into these questions with utter seriousness. However, a problem is going to arise. So that brings me to the last portion of the 19th century, moving into the early 20th century, right? And that problem is really the following: that when nationalism starts to become important, all right, and we said that yes, the Indian National Congress is founded in 1885, but when I say nationalism starts to become important, I'm speaking about mass nationalism. At this point, it's not mass nationalism, right? Indian National Congress is simply an organization founded in 1885 by a few dozen, really. Well, initially it's just a handful. Within a year, it's going to be a few dozen Indian, all men. Okay, at this point in time, there are going to be one or two women who are going to be important in the early years, but all men. Okay, and there are actually, by the way, a few Britishers. In fact, the person who's credited with founding the organization is actually a Scotsman living in India. Okay, A.O. Hume. Right? So this organization is comprised largely of lawyers. A few, what you might call journalists. That word doesn't really quite ring a bell in the second half of the 19th century. Who's a journalist in the second half of the 19th century? But people working perhaps in newspapers, you might say. Okay, and a few businessmen. That's what it is. And they want to introduce some changes. What do? They petition the government. They go knocking on doors, right? The equivalent today is, all these petitions you get by email. If you just added your name to 1 million other people, it's going to completely transform the world, right? Hundreds and thousands of these petitions circulating, right? So that in those days, it's all by hand, and it's a few people, all very educated, and you go knock on the door and say, hey, would you please consider having a few more Indians in the civil service? That's what the Indian National Congress is doing effectively. This is not mass nationalism. Okay. Well, we're actually at the end of time over here. I'm going to illustrate to you what is the particular way in which the question of women's reform and women's improvement is going to be addressed in the age of nationalism. Okay. And what is going to happen to, quote, the woman question. So that's going to be what we're going to do in the beginning part of my lecture on Tuesday, and then we'll move on to full-blown nationalism.